The Department of Homeland Security has been without funding for exactly 35 days. And this afternoon, the Senate's emergency plan to turn the lights back on derailed over two completely unrelated issues: transgender athletes and voter ID laws.
I was watching the C-SPAN feed when the wheels came off. Normally, a 5-week shutdown of the third-largest cabinet department forces a very predictable sequence. Leadership drafts a clean continuing resolution. Someone objects for the cameras. The objection gets tabled, and the money flows. Instead, we got a multi-layered procedural trap. I had to sketch the amendment tree on a napkin just to figure out what they were actually voting on.
I saw the napkin. It looked like a football playbook drawn by a toddler.
I ran out of room near the edge, but the arrows made sense to me.
Welcome to Floor Notes Extended. We have a bit more runway today, and we'll need it, because untangling how funding for the Coast Guard and the TSA got tied to state-level voting regulations requires going back to a closed-door promise made 3 weeks ago.
Exactly. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, thought he had an agreement to cap the debate. He didn't. Republican Senator Mike Lee of Utah found a gap in the unanimous consent request and drove a truck through it, demanding floor votes on those two policy riders before the funding bill could advance.
And because of how the underlying shell bill was structured back in November, Schumer couldn't just strip them out. He had to let the votes happen.
We're going to break down exactly how that procedural blind spot happened. Plus, later on, we're tracking a quiet revolt brewing in the House over the Farm Bill.
But first, we need to look at the standoff that is actively furloughing about 200,000 federal employees. Let's get into the DHS Hostage Situation.
The entire Department of Homeland Security has been operating without fresh funding since February 14th. We are well past the 5-week mark, and the cascading effects across the federal government are severe.
When a federal department of this size loses its budget, the mechanics of the shutdown are immediate. Roughly 200,000 federal employees are forced to work without pay. The most public-facing element of that workforce is the Transportation Security Administration. Screeners are managing checkpoints and processing thousands of passengers daily, while missing consecutive paychecks.
That financial strain creates a massive operational bottleneck. Agents are calling in sick to work side jobs. Some are quitting altogether to find reliable income elsewhere. Fewer agents mean fewer open security lanes, which directly translates to overwhelming crowds at the terminals.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, highlighted the deteriorating conditions at major transit hubs. He described security lines at the Austin airport stretching out the terminal doors and into the grass outside. The aviation industry is actively warning about nationwide travel gridlock if the staffing shortages continue into the peak summer travel season.
The disruption extends far beyond commercial air travel. The Coast Guard relies on Homeland Security funding for vessel maintenance, fuel, and payroll. Search and rescue operations continue, but routine patrols and long-term acquisitions freeze. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is monitoring threats to the electrical grid and water treatment facilities, while its employees figure out how to cover their mortgages.
Yet, the Senate remains completely frozen. The House successfully passed a full-year funding bill, H.R. 7147, but the upper chamber has rejected it 5 separate times. The most recent vote failed 47-37. The blockade stems from a profound disagreement over law enforcement accountability.
The catalyst for the current standoff occurred in January. A Homeland Security operation in Minneapolis resulted in the fatal shooting of 2 U.S. citizens. That incident triggered immediate demands from congressional Democrats for strict new guardrails on immigration and customs enforcement.
Democratic leadership refused to authorize a full-year budget for the agency without structural reforms attached to the money. They specifically demanded mandatory body-worn cameras to eliminate disputes over the facts of future tactical raids. They also proposed strict warrant protocols and a rule requiring plainclothes agents to remain unmasked and clearly identifiable during field operations.
Senator Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington, and Schumer are anchoring that effort. They maintain that Congress must use the appropriations process to enforce transparency on federal agents. They view a clean funding bill as providing an unchecked budget to an agency that requires serious operational oversight.
Republicans, led by Senate Minority Leader John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, reject those conditions entirely. They argue the Democrats are holding essential national security functions hostage to force controversial changes to interior immigration enforcement.
To break the stalemate, Schumer proposed a procedural carve-out. He asked the Senate to pass a standalone, clean funding resolution specifically for the Transportation Security Administration. The strategy was to restore paychecks for airport screeners and alleviate the travel delays, while keeping the broader department budget frozen to maintain maximum leverage over the ICE reforms.
Schumer framed the Republican opposition to that piecemeal approach in stark terms. He accused the GOP of weaponizing the airport delays to shield ICE from accountability. I have his exact phrasing from the floor record. Schumer said, "It is unacceptable for workers and travelers and entire airports to get taken hostage in political games. But that is what the Republicans are doing. It is unacceptable to say we will only pay TSA workers if it is attached to a bill that funds ICE with no reforms."
Thune and the Republican conference view the standalone TSA bill as a calculated trap. If they agree to fund the highly visible, politically popular parts of the department, they lose their main source of pressure to force Democrats to fund the border security and interior enforcement divisions.
The negotiations remain active but deeply deadlocked. Border Czar Tom Homan engaged in bipartisan talks with lawmakers on March 19th and March 20th. The White House actually brought forward a series of concessions aimed at breaking the logjam.
The administration offered to expand body camera requirements across ICE units. They also proposed formal limits on enforcement actions near sensitive locations, specifically schools and hospitals. Having Homan, a known hardliner on immigration enforcement, deliver those concessions to progressive lawmakers represents a fascinating shift in the administration's tactical approach.
The Democratic bloc rejected the compromise anyway. The offer from the White House did not address the demands regarding masks or the specific protocols for executing warrants. For the lawmakers galvanized by the Minneapolis shooting, those operational changes are non-negotiable requirements for any final appropriations deal.
Thune responded to that rejection by questioning the underlying motives. He argued that the refusal to accept massive concessions on body cameras reveals a different political strategy entirely. He stated on the floor that Democrats know the concept of defunding law enforcement is deeply unpopular with the electorate.
Thune accused them of purposely keeping the ICE funding dispute unresolved, so they can use the demand for accountability as an energized campaign issue heading into the November elections. He warned his colleagues across the aisle that their hostility toward law enforcement agencies would ultimately backfire at the ballot box.
While the politicians argue over the fiscal year 2026 budget, ICE is not completely devoid of resources. The agency retains access to a limited portion of its current funds, along with the $75 billion provided over a decade by previous legislation. The lights are on at the agency headquarters, but long-term operational planning is completely paralyzed.
This debate over law enforcement funding would be difficult enough to resolve on its own. The Senate floor, however, quickly transformed the Homeland Security bill into a battleground for entirely unrelated social policies.
Legislative gravity is a powerful force. When a critical funding vehicle hits the floor, members frequently maneuver to attach their highest priority messaging bills to the debate. This dynamic dragged the Save America Act and the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act directly into the airport security dispute.
Senator Marsha Blackburn, Republican of Tennessee, and Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican of Alabama, utilized the floor time to push for immediate votes on those two specific measures, pulling the conversation far away from warrants and body cameras.
Thune opened this front of the debate by highlighting a recent procedural clash. Earlier in the week, a Republican senator from Ohio offered a clean bill requiring photo identification to vote in federal elections. Democrats blocked the measure from advancing.
Thune used that blocked vote to contrast the Democratic position on airport security with their position on election security. Here is the quote from the record. So, as it turns out, Democrats support photo ID for voters, just as long as you don't actually ask them to support a photo ID bill. They want to have their cake and eat it too, shield themselves from criticism, since polls show Americans overwhelmingly support photo ID for voters, but also save themselves from having to back up their words with actions.
He went on to emphasize the operational inconsistency of requiring travelers to present a government-issued ID to board a plane, while simultaneously arguing against requiring the same documentation to cast a ballot.
Blackburn expanded on the Save America Act's framework. She cited internal polling suggesting that 71% of Democrats and over 90% of Republicans support voter ID requirements. She argued that presenting identification is a routine aspect of daily life, pointing to tasks like picking up pharmacy prescriptions or enrolling children in school.
She framed the opposition to the SAVE Act as a deliberate effort to dilute the voting power of American citizens. Blackburn contended that operating elections without citizenship verification directly facilitates illegal voting by non-citizens and temporary residents.
Then the conversation pivoted to Title IX. Tuberville took the floor to advocate for the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act. He noted this was his fourth time bringing the legislation before the chamber, reflecting a sustained effort to force his colleagues onto the record.
The bill seeks to codify an existing executive order signed by President Trump that bans transgender women from competing in female sports categories. Tuberville views this as a defining political mandate, pointing explicitly to the 2024 election results as proof that voters demand a strict biological separation in athletics.
Tuberville expressed immense frustration with the Democratic resistance to the bill. He delivered a blunt assessment from the floor. For the life of me, I cannot understand how biological males can be given the right to take away the rights of young girls.
He backed up that sentiment by citing the story of a collegiate volleyball player at San Jose State University. According to Tuberville, the student quit her team and left school after allegedly being assigned to share a hotel room with a transgender teammate without prior disclosure.
Thune also leaned heavily into the athletics argument. He listed the specific sports affected by the inclusion policies: swimming, softball, volleyball, basketball, and tennis. He read testimony from a high school runner who claimed to have lost 4 state championship titles and crucial college recruitment opportunities after competing against 2 transgender athletes.
Blackburn provided a statistical timeline for the impact of Title IX. She noted that 50 years ago, roughly 300,000 young women competed in high school and college sports. Today, that number exceeds 3 million.
She argued those opportunities are directly threatened by transgender inclusion. Blackburn cited a United Nations report claiming that female athletes have lost hundreds of medals and advancement opportunities in mixed-sex or transgender-inclusive sporting events across the globe.
Blackburn also highlighted the current enforcement actions being taken by the Department of Education. She praised Secretary McMahon for actively investigating educational institutions that violate Title IX by allowing transgender women to compete in female categories.
The underlying goal for Republicans is legislative permanence. Executive orders are temporary directives. A new administration can erase them on day one. Tuberville and Blackburn are trying to attach this ban to the Homeland Security funding bill so it becomes codified federal law.
The contrast between the two sides of the aisle is staggering. You have Schumer laser-focused on unpaid TSA agents and the immediate crisis at airport security checkpoints. You have Murray demanding strict rules of engagement for federal agents executing tactical warrants.
And simultaneously, you have Tuberville and Blackburn demanding structural changes to high school athletics and federal election protocols. They are technically debating the exact same appropriations bill, but the actual dialogue involves zero intersection.
The impasse is creating severe logistical headaches for Senate leadership. Thune warned that he may be forced to cancel an upcoming scheduled recess if a compromise is not reached quickly.
Canceling a recess is the ultimate scheduling threat in the Senate. The moment members start altering their flights home, the pressure to cut a deal increases exponentially. But it also introduces the risk of spotty attendance.
If enough senators leave town, regardless of the schedule change, the chamber loses the quorum necessary to pass a complicated compromise. A deal agreed to in principle falls apart on the floor if the requisite members are not standing at their desks to vote.
As Friday afternoon approaches, the 200,000 furloughed employees remain without a definitive timeline for their back pay. The lines at the major airport hubs continue to grow, and the negotiations between the White House and Democratic leadership remain entirely gridlocked over the ICE accountability mandates.
Which brings us back to the procedural anomaly that allowed these massive social policy debates to hijack a departmental funding resolution. We need to look at how the SAVE Act bypassed the usual committee process entirely.
Let's trace the SAVE Act's procedural maze.
The first thing to understand about the Senate floor right now is that the chamber isn't actually debating a standard bill. The technical term the presiding officer read into the record is consideration of the House message with respect to S. 1383. That procedural distinction dictates exactly what moves are available to the leadership.
S. 1383 originally passed the House of Representatives on February 11, 2026, by a margin of 218 to 213. The text itself is the Save America Act, but the way it arrived on the Senate floor is a masterclass in parliamentary blockade by Senator John Thune, RSD. He essentially built an impenetrable fortress around the legislation, using a tactic known as filling the amendment tree.
Filling the tree is one of those opaque institutional phrases that obscures a fairly aggressive maneuver. It means a party leader uses their priority of recognition, the rule that says the presiding officer must call on them before anyone else, to offer a rapid-fire sequence of amendments in every available procedural slot. Once those slots are full, no other senator can offer an amendment until the pending ones are resolved.
The Congressional Record captures the exact sequence. The clerk read out 5 distinct actions stacked on top of each other. First, Thune moved to concur with the House message. Then, he offered a substitute amendment, number 4420, on behalf of Senator Eric Schmitt, RMO. A substitute amendment replaces the entire text of the underlying bill.
But he didn't stop there. Immediately after dropping the substitute text, Thune offered a secondary amendment, number 4421, on behalf of Senator Tommy Tuberville, RAL, and Senator Marsha Blackburn, RTN. A secondary amendment modifies the First Amendment. Then, he filed a motion to refer the whole package to the Committee on Rules and Administration with instructions.
And to close the remaining loopholes, he offered 3 separate perfecting amendments to those instructions. Amendments 4422, 4423, and 4424. The first changes the enactment date. The second makes a technical adjustment to the first, and the third makes a technical adjustment to the second. It functions like a set of nesting dolls made of legislative red tape.
The result is a frozen floor. A Democrat cannot walk down the aisle and offer an amendment to strip out a provision or modify a funding mechanism, because there is physically no space left on the legislative calendar for the presiding officer to accept it. The text is locked in place.
Which brings us to the text itself. The core of Senator Schmitt's substitute amendment is the SAVE Act. The primary function of the legislation is to require documentary proof of citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections, alongside a mandate for photo identification at the ballot box.
To understand the mechanics of what the SAVE Act changes, you have to look at the baseline. It fundamentally alters the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, universally known as the Motor Voter Law. The premise of the 1993 law was to reduce friction in the registration process. If you apply for a driver's license, you can register to vote simultaneously. If you fill out a federal postcard application, you sign a sworn statement under penalty of perjury affirming your citizenship.
The SAVE Act removes the sworn statement as sufficient evidence of eligibility. Under the new requirements, an applicant must provide physical documentary proof. The acceptable documents include a United States passport, a birth certificate paired with a secondary photo ID, or a naturalization certificate. The burden of proof shifts entirely to the front end of the registration process.
The logistical reality of that shift is where the administrative challenges emerge. If you possess a valid passport, the transition is relatively frictionless. But passports cost roughly $130, and only about half of Americans hold an active one. If you rely on a birth certificate, you run into the physical delivery problem.
The legislation requires the documentation to be verified by an election official. For a voter registering by mail, this presents a significant hurdle. You cannot safely put an original raised seal birth certificate into a standard postal envelope and mail it to a county clerk's office, hoping it gets processed and returned without incident.
It effectively eliminates the utility of mail-in registration for anyone who lacks a passport. A voter in a rural county might have to drive 45 minutes to the county seat during business hours to present their documents in person. The same barrier applies to college students registering in a different state from where their parents keep their original records.
There is also a massive technical ambiguity regarding the digital infrastructure of state elections. 39 states currently utilize online voter registration portals. The text of the SAVE Act lacks explicit statutory guidance on how a state's digital system should accept and verify a scanned copy of a birth certificate or a naturalization document. Election administrators are warning that without clear federal standards for digital verification, states may have to shut down their online portals entirely to avoid compliance violations.
The context driving this procedural push revolves around election integrity and non-citizen voting. But the legal baseline is that non-citizen voting in federal elections is already a federal crime. The statute governing this is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996.
That 1996 law explicitly made it a felony for a non-citizen to vote in a federal election, punishable by fines, imprisonment, and immediate deportation. It also made the act of falsely claiming United States citizenship to register to vote a deportable offense. The penalties are exceptionally high, and comprehensive state audits consistently show that instances of non-citizens casting ballots are exceedingly rare.
Senator Blackburn approached the ID requirement from a perspective of routine verification. She took to the floor to argue that the friction of presenting an ID is a normalized part of daily life. She cited internal polling data to bolster her point.
Here is her argument from the record. Quote, 71% of all Democrats, 85% of all independents, and over 90% of all Republicans agree voter ID is a good idea. We also see the same type of numbers when it comes to the other common sense provision that if you are going to vote in a U.S. election, you really ought to be a U.S. citizen. That makes sense to people. They know that when they travel to other countries, they don't vote in those elections, even if they are there on an election day.
She connects the act of voting to everyday transactions. They show an ID many times a day, whether it is to pick up a prescription at the pharmacy, or to register for federal benefits, or to go to a child's school. The argument relies on equating the constitutional right to the franchise with commercial or administrative identity checks.
But the SAVE Act is only the first half of the procedural equation Senator Thune constructed. The second half is Amendment 4421, the secondary amendment inserted by Senators Tuberville and Blackburn. The text is officially titled "To Protect Women and Girls in Athletics," and it introduces a complete ban on transgender women participating in female sports categories.
This is where the legislative architecture gets incredibly dense. You have a secondary amendment regulating collegiate and high school athletics, attached to a substitute amendment rewriting federal voter registration laws, which is attached to a House message that is currently serving as the central leverage point in a 5-week shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security.
Senator Blackburn used her floor time to explain the precise legal mechanism she and Senator Tuberville are pursuing with the sports ban. She pointed directly to the executive branch. Quote, What the Protection of Women and Girls in Sports Act will do is to codify President Trump's executive order. I am asked regularly by Tennesseans, these executive orders are great, but when are you going to codify this and put it into law so that it will have the force of law behind it?
That distinction between an executive order and codified law is the entire ballgame for legislative strategists. An executive order dictates how federal agencies interpret Title IX enforcement, but it only lasts as long as the president who signed it remains in office. A new administration can revoke it on day one. A statute requires an act of Congress to repeal.
Blackburn framed the urgency of the amendment against the backdrop of the season, leaning heavily into regional imagery before pivoting to the political attack. She described the weather in her state, quote, "It is a gorgeous spring day. The forsythia is bright yellow and blooming. The red buds are purple, and they are magnificent. The sun is shining. In driveways all across our great state, you have young girls who are out bouncing that basketball. They are hoping for their shot to play for Vanderbilt or to be a UT Lady Vol."
And the contrast comes immediately after. She says she hopes those girls find it absolutely disgusting that her colleagues across the aisle have chosen a course of action where they cannot define woman, and they will not defend women.
Senator Tuberville followed her on the floor, expressing exasperation with the legislative process itself. He noted that this was his fourth attempt to get this specific measure passed since joining the Senate. He built his argument around a specific incident involving a collegiate athlete.
Tuberville asked the chamber to consider the logistics of college sports travel. Quote, "So what would you say to the volleyball player at San Jose University who thought that on a road trip you double up? Whether it is men's sport or women's, you double up in a hotel room before you play the next day." She did not realize that she was sharing a room and possibly even a bed with a male. She didn't know he was transgender. She did not know it. She quit school and did not get her degree because she was petrified at what she had to go through because of this body right here.
He explicitly blames the Senate for the incident, arguing that the absence of a federal ban creates the conditions for these scenarios. He then framed the political math for the upcoming elections, arguing that opposition to the ban is an electorally fatal position.
His exact numbers from the floor were 82 to 20. He said, "So this is an 82-20 issue. Common sense. I mean, there is not a lot of common sense up here, because my colleagues on the left a couple years ago tried to push on the United States that men can have babies." He warned his colleagues to look at the cameras while voting so the public could identify who opposed the measure.
The integration of these highly potent issues, voter identification, citizenship verification, and transgender athletics, creates an immense gravitational pull on the floor schedule. By embedding Amendment 4421 into the SAVE Act and locking both behind the amendment tree, the minority has effectively forced the majority to interact with these policies before any procedural progress can occur.
If you step back and look at the sequence of events, you can see how the legislative machinery grinds to a halt under the weight of these additions. A bill that originally focused on the specific verification requirements of the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 now carries the full weight of the national debate over Title IX protections and biological participation in sports.
And the clock running out in the background belongs to the Department of Homeland Security. The prolonged debate over S-1383 and its associated amendments consumes the floor time that would otherwise be dedicated to resolving the deadlock over the fiscal year 2026 appropriations package.
Every hour spent parsing the procedural validity of a secondary amendment regarding collegiate athletics is an hour not spent negotiating the operational guidelines for Customs and Border Protection or determining the back pay schedule for the Transportation Security Administration. The issues are fundamentally disconnected in substance, but they are inextricably linked by the rules of the Senate calendar.
The tension points all converge on the presiding officer's desk. The election administrators monitoring the SAVE Act are waiting for technical guidance on their digital registration portals. The county clerks are waiting for clarification on processing physical birth certificates through the mail. The state university athletic directors are tracking the Title IX codification efforts. And 200,000 federal employees are waiting for a funding resolution.
It perfectly illustrates how a single legislative vehicle absorbs the momentum of entirely separate policy spheres. A funding crisis generates the urgency, but the rules of debate allow any motivated senator to attach their highest priorities to that urgency, provided they know how to navigate the amendment tree.
As the afternoon wanes and the quorum numbers begin to look fragile, the interlocking complexities of S. 1383 remain unresolved. The legislative logjam holds steady, and the broader questions of election administration and federal funding wait for the next turn of the procedural wheel. Before we go, let's step out of the procedural weeds for a second and look at the reality outside the chamber doors.
Yeah, it is an incredibly stark contrast. Right now, as they argue over amendment trees, TSA agents are clocking into their 5th week of unpaid shifts.
Meanwhile, senators are now threatening to cancel their upcoming recess. But don't let the tough talk fool you. Nobody is keeping their weekend schedule open because a bipartisan breakthrough is actually imminent.
Exactly. It's purely a political staring contest at this point. Neither side wants to be the one caught blinking first, booking a flight home, and facing the optics of walking through a security line staffed by people working for IOUs just to start their vacation.
Nothing proves your unyielding dedication to the American people quite like a press release announcing you're staying at work. That's Floor Notes Extended for today.
Thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll keep an eye on the roll calls and let you know when this standoff finally breaks. Until next time, take care of yourselves out there.